Chapter 9, Shadow of Fear. Darting from the studio, Nancy spotted George far up the path, pursuing a man whose head was bent low. Quickly guessing that the fugitive had been caught prowling near the building, Nancy joined in the chase. In a moment, she caught up with George, but the two were unable to overtake the fleet-footed man. By the time the girls reached the boundary of the estate, he was out of sight. "It's no use," George said, halting to catch her breath. "We'll never get him now." "Did you recognize the man?" Nancy asked. "Was he near the music studio?" "I'd never seen him before. He just suddenly appeared out of the rear of the building. His head was lowered, and I couldn't get a good look at his face." Before Nancy could question George further, Mrs. Chatham and Bess hurried down the path. "What happened?" Bess asked anxiously. "We heard the cry for help. Did one of you get hurt?" "No, we're all right," George replied. "After you and Mrs. Chatham went off, the man apparently thought no one was here. He pushed aside part of the cottage wall and stepped outside. When he saw me, he took off." "Goodness!" Bess exclaimed nervously. "There must be a secret passage connected with the studio. That man probably was listening to our conversation when we were inside. He could have harmed us." "I found out how to open that secret panel in the studio only a minute ago," Nancy said. "You did?" Mrs. Chatham asked in astonishment. "I'll show you. But first I want to see the hidden door George found." George started down the path. "I'll join you in a minute," Mrs. Chatham said, turning in the opposite direction. "I'm going to call the police. It frightens me that someone is prowling about the premises." George had no difficulty locating the concealed section. Nancy pushed against the wall and stepped through the narrow opening. "This passageway must lead along the back wall to an alcove behind the piano," she called, her voice muffled. "Let's explore." "I'm not as thin as you are, Nancy," Bess complained as she attempted to follow. "I'll never make it." "Then go into the studio and enter through the secret panel. I left it open. George and I are bound to meet you somewhere." Bess vanished around the building. The other two girls moved along the inner wall until they came to an unlocked door which opened into a small chamber. "I can't see a thing," Nancy declared. "We should have brought flashlights." "Ouch!" George exclaimed. "This place must be lined with rock." Cautiously, the girls groped their way toward the half-open panel ahead. They were glad when Bess pushed it the remainder of the way, allowing light to flood the gloomy space. "What did you find?" she called. "Boxes and lots of other things," Nancy replied, gazing about her. "Do you think it's a storage room?" George asked. "Either that or some thief's hideaway for loot," Nancy commented as she examined a large Chinese vase. While the girls were inspecting two trunks, rain began to patter on the tin roof. "Just listen to that," Nancy said in dismay. "And I wanted to take a look at the footprints near the hidden door. Perhaps I can beat the storm. George, you stay inside with Bess. No sense in all of us getting wet." Hastily, Nancy looked about for a board or box lid to cover the prints, but could find neither. She ran back through the passage and outside. Footprints made by a man's large shoes were still visible. The rain descended heavily as Nancy took pencil and paper from her purse and rapidly drew an outline of 1 foot mark. The toe of the shoe was very wide, and the rubber heel had left a peculiar star design imprint. "These marks are nearly washed away now," Nancy thought ruefully, "but at least I have a sketch." She closed the secret door and scurried into the studio. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Chatham arrived with a supply of umbrellas, but insisted that the girls stay at the cottage to see the police. Presently, their car pulled up in front. The two officers questioned Mrs. Chatham and the girls regarding the trespasser. Unfortunately, George's description of him was sketchy. The only tangible clue was the footprint which Nancy had made. "This should be of some use to us," one of the policemen declared, pocketing the drawing. Before leaving, the officers inspected the hidden chamber. Mrs. Chatham readily identified many of the articles as the property of her first husband. Some she did not recognize, but assumed they must have also belonged to him. After the police had gone, Nancy asked thoughtfully, "Is it possible that Mr. Chatham knew of your hiding place and stored goods here without your knowledge?" "Yes, but I don't see why he wouldn't have told me." Mrs. Chatham paused. "Oh, I do hope nothing of John's has been stolen. It would break my heart to lose anything belonging to him." Tears glistened in her eyes as she lifted a miniature ship, similar to those which the girls had seen in the studio room. For the first time, Nancy felt herself warming to Mrs. Chatham. No doubt her strange actions resulted from grief and loneliness. The question that troubled Nancy most was, who was the mysterious fugitive, and was he hiding loot on the premises or taking articles away? But how did he learn of this place, she wondered. As Nancy mulled over the matter, she absently raised the lid of a leather-covered box. She stared in surprise and delight. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, were many large, rare seashells. "Mrs. Chatham, did your first husband collect these?" she asked breathlessly. "Yes, he did. He loved the sea and everything connected with it." "You never mentioned your first husband's last name," Nancy said, waiting eagerly for the answer. "Why, I thought I did. His name was Tomlin, John Tomlin." "Tomlin!" Nancy could hardly believe her ears. "Then he may be related to Tomlin Smith," she added, her eyes dancing with excitement. "Tomlin Smith?" the widow repeated. "Who is he, may I ask?" "Ellen's father. Mrs. Chatham, do you have a photograph of John Tomlin?" "Unfortunately, no." Nancy revealed everything she knew about Mr. Smith's quest for his missing twin brother, but did not mention the map. She also related the story she had heard from Bill Tomlin's father. "My husband had a fine baritone voice," Mrs. Chatham declared. "He loved songs of the sea and collected them." "Everything tallies with the information given me by Bill Tomlin's father. Without question, your first husband was related to the Tomlin family in Kirkland. The two men were cousins. Now, if only I can prove a relationship to Tomlin Smith. Did your husband have a middle name?" "If so, he didn't mention it. At no time did my husband tell me much about his early life," Mrs. Chatham added. "He never spoke of his father?" Nancy asked, fingering a large pink shell. "No. You see, we were married after knowing each other only 2 weeks. John settled me in a lovely little cottage, furnished it beautifully, and then set sail, but he did not return." "Was his ship lost?" Bess inquired sympathetically. "My husband was taken ill and died on a voyage to Japan," Mrs. Chatham explained, her eyes misty. The widow revealed a few additional facts, but none of great value. Her husband, she said, had been 10 years older than she and frequently had spoken of himself as a son of the sea. "That might mean his father had been a captain too," Nancy mused. "Tell me, Mrs. Chatham, did your first husband leave any papers or letters?" "Several boxes were brought to me some time after his death. I received a small amount of money and an insurance policy. I'll confess I read very few of the letters, for they seemed to be old business ones and I wasn't interested. I was too heartbroken to care. But I saved every one of them. They should be somewhere in this studio. I asked Mr. Chatham to bring them here. I'll look right—" At that instant, a fearful shriek cut the air. The group was electrified for an instant, then Nancy made a dash outside. "Mother!" came in terrified tones from somewhere to the right. "Trixie!" Nancy dashed off, with Mrs. Chatham, Bess, and George close on her heels. "Where are you?" the child's mother called. There was no answer. Frantically, the group ran to left and to right, shouting Trixie's name. Suddenly, a muffled sound reached Nancy's ears. She stopped short to listen. The child was crying and saying, "I want to get out! I want to get out!" Almost directly in front of her, Nancy saw a yawning hole in the ground. She peered down. Indistinctly, she could see a figure. "Trixie!" Nancy gasped. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay. Where's my mother?" came the sobbing voice from below. "Please help me out." The child had fallen into a dry well hole. Nancy lay down on the ground and stretched one arm into the chasm. She could not reach Trixie. "I'll get a ladder," Nancy said reassuringly. "Don't be frightened." By this time the others had come up. Mrs. Chatham, hearing that her daughter was unharmed, alternately laughed and cried. In a few minutes George located the gardener, and he brought a long ladder. "I want Nancy Drew to come down," called Trixie as the man started to descend. "Nancy, do you mind?" Mrs. Chatham asked. "Not at all." As Nancy began the climb, the woman snapped at the gardener. "Hoskins, how do you account for this uncovered hole? You are supposed to have charge of the grounds." "Mrs. Chatham, I had no idea this hole was here. Probably it was grown over and—" Nancy heard no more, for she had reached the bottom rung. Trixie, her knees slightly scratched, impulsively hugged her rescuer and scrambled up the ladder. Nancy quickly glanced about. To her right was an opening to a tunnel. The young sleuth wanted to investigate it, but decided that right now she had better hurry to the top of the well. Mrs. Chatham stood there, hugging her daughter. Nancy said mysteriously to Bess and George, "Very interesting place down there. I'll be back in a minute." She headed for her car. When Nancy returned, she held her flashlight. Bess shook her head. "Don't tell me you found something in that hole." "Uh-huh. Want to come along?" "George, you go," Bess shivered in reply. Excited over this latest development, George followed her friend into the dark pit. Nancy swung the beam of her light around the opening of the cavern. It was fairly wide and about 6 feet high. Cautiously, the girls walked in for several feet to a point where the tunnel turned abruptly. As Nancy's light exposed the cavern beyond, they stared open-mouthed. Across one wall and on the ceiling flickered the shadow of a weird, forbidding shape. End of chapter 9.